They called me a born idiot while they auctioned off my soul to save their pride. My name is Ray Gacy, and while my parents were busy skipping my graduation, I was busy buying the bank that owned their lives. A $1.2 billion empire built on the very silence they forced me into. This isn't just a story. It's a bloodless execution of the people who thought I was nothing. But before the world knew my name, I had to survive the shadows of the people who were supposed to love me. I can still taste the bitterness of that evening, the way the night air pressed against the windows like an uninvited guest, thick with the weight of a 20-year lie. To understand the fire that eventually consumed them, you have to see the moment the match was struck. The humidity of a Houston night always feels like a heavy wool blanket, but inside the Gacy estate, the air conditioning hums with a clinical, expensive chill. I smoothed the rough polyester fabric of my service uniform, the starch scratching against my neck. It was a cruel, deliberate costume. Outside the kitchen doors, the rhythmic clink of crystal and the low murmur of Houston's elite drifted in like a taunt. I stood by the stainless steel prep table, watching the caterers arrange hors d'oeuvres with frantic precision. I wasn't a guest at my parents' 30th anniversary gala. I was the help. In this house, perfection is the only currency, and according to Gacy and Borden, I had been born bankrupt. The heavy oak door swung open, and my father stepped into the kitchen. He looked immaculate in his bespoke tuxedo, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light. He didn't look at my face. He looked at his Rolex. "The Sterling Group just arrived, Ray," he said, his voice as cold as the marble floors. "The wine needs to stay flowing. Do not speak unless spoken to. Keep your head down and stay in character. We can't have you ruining the evening with your limitations." I looked at him, my expression a mask of practiced obedience. "I know my place tonight, Father," I replied quietly. He grunted in approval and swept back into the ballroom. My heart hammered a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. Not of fear, but of focus. I've lived 22 years in the shade of his towering ego, but I've learned something he never will. A tree isn't defined by the shadow it casts, but by the strength of its roots. He thinks I am dim-witted because I am silent. He doesn't realize that silence is where I built my empire. As I moved toward the ballroom with a tray of vintage Cabernet, I saw Mrs. Gable, an elderly server who had worked for our family since I was a child, stumble over a loose rug. Her tray tilted dangerously. I moved instinctively, catching her arm and stabilizing the silver platter before a single drop was spilled. "I've got you, Mary," I whispered, offering her a small, reassuring smile. She looked at me with watery eyes, her hands trembling. "Thank you, Ray. You've always been the kind soul in this place. Integrity isn't about who is watching when you're on top. It's about who you are when everyone thinks you're nothing." I pushed through the double doors and entered the grand ballroom. The opulence was blinding. Gold leaf molding, silk draperies, and the scent of expensive perfume clashing with cigar smoke. Gacy saw me and caught my arm, his fingers digging into my elbow with a warning squeeze. He didn't pull me aside. He pulled me into the center of a circle of oil tycoons. "And here is our Ray," he announced, his voice booming with a hollow, performative warmth. "She's our little reminder of life's unpredictability. A born idiot, as the doctor said, but we keep her close. It's a heavy cross to bear, but family is family, right?" A heavy silence followed, broken only by the pitying sighs of the socialites. I felt the heat of 100 judgmental eyes. Indira, my older sister, stepped forward, her designer gown shimmering like snake scales. She reached out and patted my cheek, a gesture so condescending it felt like a slap. "Poor Ray," Indira chirped to the group. "She's the anchor that keeps us grounded in reality. Without her, we might forget how lucky we are to have brains." The guests chuckled, soft, uncomfortable sounds that made my skin crawl. I stood perfectly still, my gaze serene and unshakable. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I memorized every face in that circle, the mockers, the bystanders, the conspirators. Their arrogance was a thick fog, blinding them to the girl standing right in front of them. Have you ever been looked at but never truly seen? It's a strange kind of freedom. They didn't see me because they were too busy admiring the reflection of their own egos in the wine I was pouring. By 10 o'clock, I retreated to the dim service hallway. The roar of the party became a dull thrum. I reached into the hidden pocket of my apron and pulled out a burner phone. The screen's glow was the only light in the corridor. I pulled up the live ticker for Ethelred Capital. The market was bleeding exactly as my algorithms had predicted. While my father toasted to his legacy with the money he was bleeding, my net worth ticked upward by another 7 figures. The irony wasn't lost on me. I moved deeper into the shadows near the library when I heard muffled voices. My mother, Borden, was speaking in a frantic low tone. "The liquidity isn't there, Gacy. If the Sterling deal doesn't close by the end of the month, the banks will seize the Houston holdings." My father's response was a low growl. "That's why we have Ray. Sterling wants a traditional girl, someone he can mold. We sell him the idea of the innocent, simple daughter, and he signs the debt forgiveness. She's our golden ticket out of this mess." I leaned my head against the cool wallpaper, my breath hitching. They weren't just neglecting me, they were preparing to trade me like a piece of livestock to cover their own failures. I looked down at the phone in my hand, the numbers on the screen glowing like a silent promise. They think they are selling a daughter to save their pride. They have no idea they are trying to negotiate with the woman who already owns their bank. The numbers on my phone screen were still glowing, a constellation of binary power that my family couldn't even begin to fathom. I slipped the device back into my apron and moved through the silent corridor, the heavy oak doors of the library looming ahead like a gateway to a past they were desperate to incinerate. The smell hit me before I even turned the brass handle, the sharp, acrid scent of burning paper and old ink. It was a smell that belonged in a fireplace, yet it felt like a violation of the sanctuary I had called home for 2 decades. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning as if in protest. My mother, Borden, stood by the hearth, her silhouette framed by the dancing orange flames. She didn't turn when I entered. She simply watched as another sheaf of my papers curled into blackened lace. Those were my 3 years of financial algorithms, my meticulously plotted Stanford preparation notes, and the blueprints for a life she never wanted me to have. The heat from the fire radiated across the room, but the look on her face was pure frost. She held my final folder over the embers, her knuckles pale and steady. "It's for your own good, Ray," she said, her voice a calm, clinical drone that cut through the crackle of the wood. "We're cleaning up these delusions. Your father and I have worked too hard to let your little hobbies ruin the Sterling merger. You need to focus on being the woman a man like Sterling expects. A submissive wife doesn't need a library. She needs a legacy of obedience." With a flick of her wrist, the last of my physical world fell into the fire. I stood there, my arms hanging loose at my sides. I didn't scream. I didn't rush forward to save the smoldering remains. A bridge isn't made of wood or stone, but of the will to cross to the other side. My mother wanted a reaction, a tantrum to prove my instability, but I gave her nothing but the steady rhythm of my breathing. Everything she had just burned was already backed up to a decentralized cloud she couldn't even define. She was destroying the map, but I was the one who had already memorized the terrain. "Are you truly happy, Mother?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Living as an architect of someone else's misery? A family should be a sanctuary for dreams, not a graveyard for them." Borden finally looked at me, her eyes narrowing as if she were seeing a stranger for the first time. She didn't answer. She simply adjusted her pearls and walked past me, the silk of her gown whispering against the carpet. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing like a gavel. I sank to my knees on the Persian rug, the heat of the fire warming my face. I reached out, my fingers brushing the gray, fragile flakes of what used to be my hard work. This was the moment the last emotional cord finally snapped. I wasn't waiting for her approval anymore. I wasn't hoping for a seat at their table. They had forced me to build my future in the dark, and in doing so, they had given me a vision that worked perfectly in the shadows. I was the ghost they had created, and now I was the only one who knew how to haunt them. Among the charred debris, I saw a corner of something that hadn't fully burned. It was a small, silver-framed photograph of my grandmother, Eleanor. I pulled it from the ash, wiping the soot from her kind, knowing eyes. She was the only one who had seen through the "born idiot" label my father had plastered on me at 7 years old. I pressed the cold metal to my lips, a silent promise humming in my chest. I would protect the legacy my father was currently trying to liquidate, even if I had to dismantle his world to do it. The silence of the library was suddenly broken by a soft rustle from the deep shadows of the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. My pulse quickened, but I didn't move. A figure emerged into the moonlight streaming through the high windows. It was Vance, my grandmother's former advisor, his silver hair catching the light. He looked at the fireplace, then back at me, his expression a mixture of grief and grim determination. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell me it would be okay. "Your grandmother knew the wolves were at the door, Ray," Vance said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a high-security encrypted USB drive, the metal casing glinting like a weapon. "She left you the keys to the kingdom. She knew Gacy would try to erase you, just as he tried to erase her when she grew old. But she was an architect, and she built a cellar they never found." He stepped forward and pressed the drive into my hand. I looked at the small device, the weight of it feeling heavier than the entire mansion. Vance leaned in closer, his eyes sharp. "Gacy is setting a trap for your graduation, Ray. It's not just a business move. He's finalizing a transfer of personhood. He wants to sign a guardianship agreement that will strip you of every legal right you have in this country. He's selling your freedom to Sterling to pay for a decade of his own vanity." I looked at the fireplace, then at the man who had been the only anchor of hope in my grandmother's final days. "He's fighting for a seat at a table that's already been sold, Vance," I said, my voice cold and steady. "He thinks he's negotiating from a position of power, but his liquidity is a mirage. I've been watching his accounts bleed for 18 months. I'm not the one who needs a guardian. He's the one who needs a miracle." Vance allowed a ghost of a smile to touch his lips. "The merger is the trigger, Ray. They intend to execute the guardianship papers the moment you step off that graduation stage. They want to ensure you never have the legal capacity to challenge the family trust." I closed my fist around the USB drive, the metal biting into my palm. It was a reminder that the truth doesn't need a stage. It only needs a foundation. I watched the last spark of my childhood hope die in that fireplace. But as Vance stepped back into the shadows, a new kind of clarity settled into my bones. The fire hadn't destroyed my world. It had simply illuminated the path out of it. The Texas sun hammered down on the University of Houston Stadium, turning the sea of black graduation gowns into a shimmering, sweltering heat trap. I stood on the elevated podium, the heavy summa cum laude metal cool against my chest, a sharp contrast to the scorching air. From this height, I could see thousands of faces. Parents gripping cameras, grandparents dabbing tears, siblings cheering until their voices cracked. It was a symphony of belonging that reached everyone but me. My eyes drifted to the front row VIP section. 3 white chairs stood out like fresh wounds. The gold embossed nameplates for Gacy, Borden, and Indira sat perfectly centered on the velvet cushions, mockingly vacant. I leaned into the microphone, my voice steady, betraying none of the hollowness carved into my spirit. "We are often told to wait for someone to light our path," I told the graduating class, my gaze fixed on the horizon rather than the empty seats. "But the world doesn't always provide a torch. Sometimes, you must become the fire that guides yourself home. Integrity isn't about the applause of a crowd. It's about the quiet strength you find when the only person watching is the one in the mirror." I acknowledged my family's absence with a graceful nod to the empty air, refusing to let their neglect dim the brilliance of my achievement. Backstage, while the air filled with tossed caps and joyous screams, I checked my phone. A notification from Instagram flashed. Indira had posted a live stream. She was at a luxury horse race 500 miles away in Kentucky. The camera panned to Gacy, who was raising a glass of vintage champagne, his face flushed with pride. "To Indira's new Porsche," he roared over the sound of thundering hooves. "And to the only daughter who actually makes this family look good." The laughter that followed was a jagged blade, cutting through the thin veil of my composure. I tucked the phone away, my fingers numb. True belonging is not found in a seat at a table where you aren't wanted. It is found in the peace of knowing your own worth. I drove back to the Gacy estate still wearing my graduation gown. The fabric felt like a shroud. As I pulled into the circular driveway, the massive limestone mansion stood silent, a mausoleum of limestone and lies. There were no balloons, no congratulations banners. not even a porch light left on. I stepped into the grand foyer, the click of my heels echoing off the marble floors like a countdown. The air smelled of lemon polish and expensive stagnation. I had come home to find my passport, intending to leave for Stanford that very night. But the silence of the house was interrupted by a low, desperate vibration coming from the library. I paused at the heavy double doors, the shadows of the hallway swallowing me whole. Gacy's voice drifted through the gap, sharp, panicked, and stripped of the boardroom authority he wore like armor. "You have to understand, Sterling, the liquidity issue is temporary," he pleaded. My breath hitched as I heard the name of the man he was speaking to, the billionaire creditor whose shadow hung over half of Houston's commercial real estate. "I'm signing the personal guarantee now, but the collateral, it's better than cash. It's a strategic alliance. We'll integrate my youngest Ray into your family. A marriage merger. It settles the $100 million debt and secures your legacy with the Whitford bloodline." I pressed my back against the cold wall, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure, icy clarity. I wasn't just being ignored, I was being liquidated. My father was treating my life as a line item on a balance sheet, a personal guarantee to buy himself another year of vanity. Under U.S. contract law, such a coercive arrangement was a legal nightmare, but in the world of high-stakes dynasties, it was a silent execution. He was trading my soul to write off a corporate blunder. It was a flesh and debt contract, a transfer of personhood that treated me as nothing more than a movable asset. I moved slightly, peering through the crack of the door. Gacy was leaning over his mahogany desk, his hand trembling as he scribbled on a document that looked like a standard debt restructuring agreement. But hidden within the fine print was a strategic marriage alliance clause. I pulled out my phone, the camera lens focused on the paper and the desperate man behind it. Every word, every signature, every breath was being captured. I wasn't a victim in this hallway. I was a predator recording the evidence of its prey's final mistake. Gacy's hollow laugh echoed through the room as he looked up at the speakerphone. "She's an idiot, Sterling. Born that way. She won't even realize she's been sold until the ring is on her finger and the papers are filed. She doesn't have the mental capacity to resist. It's a clean sweep." He sounded relieved, as if he had just successfully disposed of a piece of faulty equipment. He had no idea that the idiot was standing 5 feet away, holding the digital evidence that would eventually dismantle his entire existence. I quietly retreated down the hallway, my graduation gown rustling like dry leaves. Near the stairs, a shadow detached itself from the gloom. It was Vance. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were filled with a grim, fatherly sorrow. He handed me a single manila envelope. Inside were bank statements showing Gacy had systematically tampered with my grandmother's trust fund, siphoning off my inheritance to fund Indira's Porsche and his own failing ventures. It was a paper trail of betrayal that stretched back years. I looked at the documents, then back at the closed library doors. They had taken my seat at the table, my family's love, my hard-earned trust, and now they were trying to take my very freedom. They had left me with nothing but the clothes on my back and the fire in my mind. "You think you're selling a daughter to save a sinking ship?" I whispered into the cold air of the foyer. The words a silent vow. "You don't realize I already own the water beneath you." As I walked out of the house and toward the car, the Texas night felt cooler, the stars sharper. The weight of the world hadn't changed, but my relationship to it had. I was no longer the daughter seeking a home. I was the architect preparing to tear down a prison. Behind me, the Gacy estate glittered in the moonlight, a beautiful empty shell. I drove away without looking back, the engine's hum a steady promise of the storm to come. The blue light from 4 widescreen monitors reflected off my glasses, casting a ghostly pallor over my face in the dim sanctuary of Ethelred Capital's downtown headquarters. Outside, the Houston skyline hummed with the energy of a city built on oil and grit. But inside this room, the only sound was the clinical whir of the cooling fans. I sat perfectly still as I stared at the formal email from Stanford University. Application withdrawn. The words felt like a digital guillotine. My hands didn't tremble. They simply rested on the mahogany desk, cold and motionless. I opened the server logs, my eyes scanning the biometric entry history. Indira. She had used her thumbprint to bypass my phone's security while I slept under the roof of the estate, then mouthed on me to send the withdrawal. The attached letter was a masterpiece of cruelty, claiming that I, Ray, was suffering from severe mental instability and was unfit to pursue higher education. She hadn't just stolen a seat at a university, she had attempted to kill my future with a few keystrokes. It was a calculated assassination of my potential. I leaned back, watching a video Indira had just posted to her 2 million followers. She was laughing, holding up a dusty, yellowing folder. My childhood diagnosis from 15 years ago. The truth about my sister, she told the camera with performative sadness. A born idiot who thinks she can buy her way into Stanford. She used my past as her platform, turning my struggle into her content. I closed my eyes and took a single deep breath. Character is like a diamond. It is formed under pressure, not destroyed by it. Indira's act wasn't a defeat. It was the final legal justification I needed to stop protecting her. I glanced at a framed photo on the corner of the desk. Indira and I as toddlers, holding hands in a field of bluebonnets. I don't hate her for what she took. I pity her for thinking she could ever own a mind like mine. She sees the world through the lens of fame and borrowed status, unaware that the sister she just betrayed is the one who holds the deed to her life. Every move she makes is a predictable reaction, while every move I make is a silent calculation. The heavy, reinforced door to the sanctuary hissed open. Vance stepped in, his face grim, carrying a thick physical file of Gacy Industries' corporate debts. The room felt smaller as he approached. "She did it, Ray," he said, his voice a low rasp. "The Stanford letter, the social media campaign. It's a full-scale character assassination." I didn't turn around. I kept my gaze on the monitors. Complexity is the playground of the mind, Vance. They think they are predators stalking a lamb, but they've just walked into an architect's trap. Vance set the file down. "Gacy believes the leak you provided. He thinks you have a secret offshore inheritance account from Eleanor, and he's desperate to seize it." I finally turned the chair, my expression steady and unreadable. "Good. Have the attorneys finalized the debt assumption agreement?" Vance nodded, a shadow of a smile touching his lips. Following U.S. commercial law, we had drafted documents that Gacy and Indira believed were keys to my money. In reality, by signing them, they were legally tying their personal assets and the remaining family trust to a corporate debt that Ethelred Capital already owned. This was the anchor's counterstrike. They were so blinded by greed that they failed to perform basic due diligence on the Ethelred entity. They saw a payday, I saw a foreclosure. "He thinks he's taking from me," I whispered, the words hanging in the sterile air. "But he's actually handing me the title to his house." Vance asked if I was ready to drop the mask. "Not yet. The trap needs to be absolute. I want them to feel the weight of the victory right before the floor disappears beneath them." I returned to the Gacy estate that evening, the heavy limestone walls feeling more like a prison than ever. I walked past the grand staircase, where Indira stood gloating over her phone. "Oh, Ray," she called out, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "I heard about Stanford. Such a shame. I guess some brains just aren't built for that kind of pressure. Maybe you can find a nice hobby, like gardening?" I didn't argue. I didn't defend my intelligence. I simply smiled, a small, vague smile that she took for defeat. "I'm sure you're right, Indira," I said softly, continuing toward the library. Behind me, she laughed, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed in the foyer. The house was eerily quiet, the calm before a storm that would leave nothing standing. I knew that my finger was already hovering over the execute button on my phone, but I needed one more piece of evidence. I needed them to commit the ultimate act of coercion. Gacy entered the library a few minutes later, wearing a mask of predatory warmth. He handed me a legal document, his hand resting heavily on my shoulder. "We're going to take a little vacation, Ray. To visit Sterling. I just need you to sign these guardianship papers. It's for your protection, given your recent episodes." He was trying to execute a legal death, stripping me of my autonomy so I could never challenge the family trust or the merger. I looked at the pen he offered. It felt heavier than a weapon. A ship is safe in harbor, but that's not what ships are for. And a mind is safe in silence, but that's not how it changes the world. My parents' cruelty was so absolute that it had become perfectly predictable. They were following a script I had already edited. As I reached for the pen, my phone buzzed in my apron pocket. A one-word text from Vance. Initiated. The takeover had begun. The accounts were freezing. The walls were closing in, and they were the only ones who didn't know the house was on fire. "Ray, are you listening?" Gacy urged, his voice tight with an impatience he couldn't quite hide. "Just sign. Everything will be better once you let us take care of you." I looked up at him, and for the first time I let a flicker of my true self show in my eyes. A cold, calculating light that made him flinch for a fraction of a second. "I'm listening, Father," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'm listening to everything." They wanted me to stay silent. They wanted me to stay small. They wanted a daughter they could sell to pay for their mistakes. Tomorrow, the world will find out that my silence wasn't a lack of thought, but the sound of an empire collapsing. I put the pen to the paper, knowing that this signature wasn't my end, but the beginning of their final chapter. The storm was no longer coming. It was here. The heavy brass latch of the private meeting room clicked into place with a finality that made the air in the room vanish. High ceilings and crown molding usually offered a sense of grandeur at the Gacy estate, but tonight they felt like the lid of a very expensive coffin. I took my seat at the polished mahogany table, the wood reflecting the cold, sterile glow of the recessed lighting. Across from me, Gacy wore a mask of rehearsed, oily sympathy, while Indira sat beside him, a jagged smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. The electronic lock engaged with a faint hum. We were alone, or so they thought. The tiny transmitter tucked behind my ear canal pulsed with the faint, comforting static of Vance's presence on the other end. Gacy didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid a thick stack of papers toward me, a petition for appointment of permanent guardian. The bold, black letters at the top seemed to vibrate with malice. He was claiming I was mentally incompetent, a danger to my own safety and assets. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into that patronizing baritone he used for difficult clients and broken daughters. "Ray, honey, after the Stanford episode and your recent, erratic behavior, we've consulted with the best specialists. You're sick. You need us to step in and handle things. It's for your own protection." I looked him directly in the eye, my gaze a calm, impenetrable mirror. He was trying to gaslight me in a room he owned, using my sister's fraud as his primary evidence. I thought of the countless other invisible children across Houston, souls crushed under the weight of guardianship abuse by parents who saw their offspring as nothing more than trust fund access codes. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was a reckoning. My voice was a soft, steady whisper that carried more weight than his theatrical concern. "A parent's duty is to give their child wings, Father. Not to build a cage and call it a home." Gacy's expression didn't flicker. He simply slid a gold fountain pen across the table. It rolled slowly, the metal clicking against the wood like a spent shell casing. "Just sign the acknowledgement, Ray. We'll take care of the heavy lifting. You'll never have to worry about the world or its pressures again. You can just be." The false concern in his voice was so thick it was suffocating. He was offering me legal death, a life where I could no longer own property, sign contracts, or even decide where I lived. If I signed this, Gacy Industries would swallow Ethelred Capital before the sun came up. I reached out and picked up the pen. My fingers were steady, my movements fluid. They didn't know that the pen Vance had swapped into my bag earlier contained a specific disappearing ink, one that would vanish completely within 3 hours, leaving only a blank page and a lot of explaining to do in court. More importantly, the bridge of my glasses housed a microscopic high-definition camera, capturing the predatory gleam in Gacy's eyes, and the way Indira leaned in, eager to witness my surrender. This was the ultimate sting operation, and the primary target was the man who called me his daughter. "So if I sign this," I asked, playing the part of the confused, hesitant victim, "you'll have total control over my bank accounts? And my grandfather's trust? Even the business decisions?" I needed him to say it. I needed the verbal confirmation of his intent to commit fiduciary fraud. Gacy nodded, his greed finally overriding his caution. "Everything, Ray. To protect the family legacy from your unfortunate condition. It's the only way to keep the Sterling merger on track." He had just confessed to using a guardianship petition to secure a corporate merger. In the state of Texas, that's called a felony. I put the pen to the paper, the scratch of the nib the only sound in the room. I signed Ray Gacy in a slow, deliberate script. Gacy snatched the document away the moment the last loop was finished, his eyes burning with a sudden, terrifying triumph. He didn't even look at the signature. He just saw the ink. He believed he had finally won. He believed he had locked the born idiot in a room and swallowed the key. He looked at Indira and nodded. The deal was done. Indira couldn't contain herself any longer. She let out a sharp metallic laugh that grated against the quiet of the room. See? I told you, Dad. Even a born idiot knows when she's beaten. Enjoy your new life in the care facility, Ray. I'll make sure to send you postcards from all the places I'll be going with your money. She looked at me with a malice so pure it was almost beautiful in its honesty. She truly believed I was beneath her, even now. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I simply stood up, my posture shifting from the slumped, defeated girl they expected to the commanding architect I had always been. The transition was so abrupt that Gacy actually recoiled. I straightened my blazer, the cold light of the room catching the fire in my eyes. You didn't sign my life away, Father, I said, my voice projecting with the authority of a woman who owns the sky. You just provided the state with the recorded evidence of your own fraud, coercion, and intent to embezzle. The silence that followed was absolute. Gacy's face went from triumphant to a sickly mottled gray. He looked at the paper, then back at me. What are you talking about? He reached for his desk phone, his hand trembling. Security! I need security in here now! He was panicking, the predator realizing the cage was actually around him. Indira's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. I didn't need to answer him. At that exact second, the lights in the mansion flickered, a sudden surge in the grid as the Ethelred Capital servers began their final assault. A synchronized chorus of pings echoed from their phones on the table. A news alert was flashing across every financial site in the country. Ethelred Capital launches hostile takeover of Gacy Industries. Federal investigation into CEO fraud pending. The sound of the alerts was like a funeral knell. Gacy stared at his phone, his jaw working but no words coming out. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw him truly afraid. He didn't see the idiot anymore. He saw the woman who had spent 20 years learning his every weakness while he was busy ignoring her strength. He had tried to lock me in a room, never realizing that I was the one who owned the building, the locks, and the key to his prison. The storm hadn't just arrived. It had already made landfall. The boardroom of Gacy Industries atop the Houston skyline was a glass cage of soaring ambition and desperate secrets. Outside, the city pulsed like a distant heartbeat, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and the metallic tang of impending failure. Gacy sat at the head of the polished walnut table, sweat beading on his forehead despite the sub-zero climate control. He was leaning over a set of documents, trying to convince Sterling and the board of directors that a final merger was their only salvation. I sat in a chair tucked into the far corner, a quiet ghost in a room full of titans, supposedly under the watchful eye of Indira. Indira leaned toward me, her voice a sharp, jagged whisper. Stay quiet, Ray. The adults are talking. She didn't even look at me. Her eyes were fixed on Gacy, hungry for the status this deal would bring her. My father cleared his throat, his hand hovering over the guardianship papers from the previous week. He was attempting to use those fraudulent documents to sign away my voting rights in the family trust directly to Sterling. It was a play for total control, a final act of erasure. The room shifted when Sterling, a man whose silence was more intimidating than Gacy's noise, tapped a finger on a balance sheet. There's a $100 million liquidity gap in your offshore holdings, Gacy, Sterling said, his voice flat. Explain the numbers. My father stammered, his polished boardroom armor finally cracking. He looked at his CFO, then back at the sheet, offering a string of jargon that meant absolutely nothing. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, and for the first time, the board was watching him go under. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and so unexpected that the entire room went silent. Indira grabbed my sleeve, hissed my name, but I brushed her hand away with a strength that made her gasp. I walked to the edge of the table. The liquidity gap isn't a mistake, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice projecting with a clarity that silenced the hum of the air conditioning. It's a structured withdrawal. It was moved through 3 shell corporations in the Cayman Islands before being reinvested into Ethelred Capital. The shock in the room was a physical weight. I didn't stop. I began explaining the complex flow of funds in Mandarin to the lead investor from Shanghai, then switched to German to address the European board members, before finishing in French for the head of the legal audit. Knowledge is not a gift given by others. It is a treasure found by those who refuse to stop looking. I looked Gacy in the eye, seeing the man who had called me an idiot for 15 years. I had spent that time observing his fraud, using his dismissal of me as the ultimate shield. The heavy double doors of the boardroom opened, and Vance entered, flanked by a team of federal-level attorneys. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to the center of the table and placed a fresh, glossy copy of Forbes in front of Gacy. The cover featured my face, sharp and unyielding, under the headline, "The Ghost of Wall Street: How a 22-year-old Built a $1.2 billion Empire in Silence." The sound of the magazine hitting the wood was the loudest sound I had ever heard, the sound of 20 years of lies shattering under the weight of a single cover. Total silence followed. Gacy's jaw dropped, his face turning a sickly mottled gray. Indira's face went white, her hand flying to her mouth. Vance leaned over and presented the board with the official proof. Ethelred Capital had successfully completed a hostile takeover of Gacy Industries' debt. Under U.S. bankruptcy and corporate law, I was no longer the daughter in the corner. I was the primary secured creditor and the new owner of my father's company. The table had not only turned, it had been replaced. "This is a lie!" Indira screamed, her perfect composure finally disintegrating. "She's incapable. She has a diagnosis." I didn't raise my voice. I simply slid a small digital player across the table to the board's legal counsel. I pressed play. Gacy's voice filled the room. The recording from our private meeting where he admitted to guardianship, fraud, coercion, and his intent to embezzle my trust to pay for Sterling's debt. "I didn't do this to destroy you, Father," I said softly, my voice devoid of malice but full of truth. "I did this to stop you from destroying anyone else. Truth doesn't cost anything, but a lie eventually costs you everything." Outside the doors, the private security Gacy had hired was being replaced by a team wearing the Ethelred insignia. I watched my father realize that his name was being stripped from the very building we stood in. I didn't feel the triumph I had expected. Instead, I felt a profound, quiet pity. Justice isn't a weapon, it's a mirror. Gacy and Indira were served with immediate cease and desist orders and a notice of federal investigation for financial coercion. Sterling, ever the opportunist, looked at me with new eyes and offered me a seat at his right hand. I declined with a simple, steady shake of my head. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Houston skyline. The greatest prison people live in is the fear of what others think of them. I've spent my life outside those walls, and the air was finally sweet. Gacy was being led out by the attorneys, his shoulders slumped, his legacy in tatters. As he passed me, he whispered, "You've won, Ray, but you have no family left." I looked at Vance and the small team who had actually stood by me when I was nothing. I smiled, the expression reaching my eyes for the first time. I finally have the only family that matters, the one built on truth. The silence in that boardroom was the turning point I'd been waiting for my whole life. They'd spent 20 years trying to sell off my future because they thought I was too slow to realize it. They didn't realize that I was the one holding the market. The empty chairs at my graduation weren't a sign of failure, but a sign of freedom. I wasn't the fool they'd made me. I was the architect who had finally finished the job. The Houston fog clung to the windows of the Gacy estate like a lingering ghost, blurring the lines between the limestone mansion and the gray morning sky. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, my hand resting on the banister I once polished until my knuckles ached. Below me, the great hall was a battlefield of cardboard and packing tape. Professional movers, hired by my firm, methodically hauled away the French antiques and the velvet drapes. Each item was tagged with a bright, clinical sticker. Property of Ethelred Capital. The weight of 20 years didn't just lift, it evaporated. I wasn't walking through these halls as a daughter seeking a crumb of affection, but as the owner overseeing a transition of power. In the darkened living room, Gacy and Borden sat on the edge of a plastic-covered sofa. Their faces were etched with the jagged lines of a shock that had yet to settle. Across from them, Indira sat on a trunk, her designer luggage looking pathetic in the middle of a foreclosed empire. She was staring at her manicured nails, her shoulders shaking with a quiet, terrified weeping. She couldn't fathom a reality where her private jet had been repossessed, and her status was no longer a birthright. The house felt like a museum whose patrons had forgotten to pay the bill. Vance stood near the fireplace, his posture as straight and sharp as a legal brief. He held a final court order, explaining with cold precision why the house and every personal asset within it now belonged to my company. Because of the security interest they had blindly signed months ago, their attempt to steal my money had instead tethered their lives to a debt they could never pay. It was a mathematical certainty they hadn't seen coming. I watched them with a steady, quiet gaze. A house built on lies has no foundation. It was never a home, Father. It was just a stage for a play that finally ended. The silence grew heavy, filled only by the distant thud of a moving truck door. Gacy looked up at me, his eyes hollow and defeated. "Where are we supposed to go, Ray? You've taken everything." I didn't answer with a speech about revenge. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked them to the back of the estate, past the manicured gardens to the modest, low-ceilinged staff quarters where they had once tried to confine my spirit. This was the place where they had hoped to hide their idiot daughter away from the eyes of Houston's elite. I stopped at the small wooden door and turned to face them. I revealed that I had already filed the paperwork to convert the Gacy estate into the Eleanor Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing resources for children with learning disabilities. I told Gacy and Borden they could stay in the staff quarters rent-free, but with a condition that made Gacy flinch. They would work as the foundation's maintenance and janitorial staff. I am not taking your lives, as you tried to take mine. I am giving you a chance to earn your dignity through honest work. You will help the children you once called idiots find their own strength. Happiness isn't found in having the most. It's found in needing the least and giving the best of yourself. I saw the realization hit them, that their punishment wasn't prison, but the mirror of their own past cruelty. They would have to witness the success of the very minds they had spent a lifetime dismissing. Indira looked at me, her face a mask of disbelief, but for the first time, she had nothing to say. I turned away, the sound of my footsteps on the gravel driveway firm and resolute. The ultimate power is not the ability to crush an enemy, but the ability to refuse to be defined by their choices. I stood at the massive iron gates of the estate, a single suitcase by my side. Vance pulled up in a simple, elegant car to take me to the airport. I looked back at the house one last time. In the morning light, I saw a young child with a notebook entering the front door, guided by a teacher who looked at him with encouragement. A new legacy was beginning in the ruins of the old one. I checked my phone. An email from Stanford was waiting. The dean had personally reinstated my fellowship with a long, rambling apology for the misunderstanding. I didn't read past the first paragraph. I deleted the message. I no longer needed an Ivy League seal to know that my mind was a masterpiece. "Are you happy, Ray?" Vance asked as he loaded my bag into the trunk. I looked at the Houston skyline, then at the horizon where my new life was waiting. I smiled, a genuine warm expression that had nothing to do with corporate takeovers and everything to do with self-possession. I'm not happy because I won, Vance. I'm happy because I'm finally Ray. And that's more than enough for any lifetime. I had spent 20 years in the dark, but the light I found there was mine alone. They spent 20 years calling me an idiot. I spent 1 year proving them wrong. But as the plane leveled off above the Texas clouds, I looked down at the shrinking world below and knew I would spend the rest of my life proving myself right. I had always owned the sky. The greatest victory isn't making those who hurt you suffer. It's living so well that their memory no longer has a place in your heart. Have you ever had to walk away from everything just to find yourself? Have you ever realized that the people who called you a failure were just afraid of your potential? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one because I know what it's like to be the one who wasn't supposed to make it.